Okay, let's go.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the week 5 of Learning GRC in 12 weeks with me, Priyanka Chatterjee. Thank you for being back here. And for those, if this is the first video that you have stumbled upon, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel so that you can get notified of all the videos and tutorials that will come up in the next over the next 7 weeks. So without further ado, let's get started. So you can see my Christmas pajamas are already on. And sorry if I sound a little bit nosy, but for those who follow me on LinkedIn, you would know that I've been traveling a little bit. So I've got a bit of a stuffy nose. So I'm just trying to do this tutorial today, a little bit in a cozy mode. And obviously with Christmas coming up along, I'm getting into a happy space because it's the end of the year, the streets are up and bright. So for those that celebrate Christmas, please have a happy holidays. And those who have planned leaves, try to take some time off. But before we do that, let's get started and learn about cybersecurity control domains here. So before we start with today's week, we will look at let's do a quick recap of what we learned in the last weeks. So over the last 4 weeks, we had looked at the fundamentals or the foundations of what governance, risk, and compliance is. More specifically, in the last week, we talked about compliance management, how it is important to protect our data and avoid penalties and fines, how we need to take a proactive approach. And we also looked at the fact that we do need to take a structured approach. We talked about the 5 different stages of compliance management process and how we can make it and take it to mature compliance management practice within our organizations. So with that, let's start looking at what the cybersecurity control domains are all about. Now, creating this specific tutorial was quite tricky from my own perspective because each of these domains are specializations in themselves. So the big challenge that I had in my mind was, how do I pack all of that knowledge that people really can specialize in into one tutorial? So I would go into today's session with a little bit of disclaimer here that I would use this tutorial more as an introduction to the cybersecurity control domains. Now, to add to that, I don't want to leave you hanging by just introducing you to the domains, but in time, I will also share some resources on my LinkedIn page so that you can read and learn a little bit more into each of these domains. But for this session today, we will look at what the domains are, and we will look at understanding how all of these different security measures, or what we call as controls in cybersecurity language, they come together to actually give us a more comprehensive and more holistic defense framework or a protection framework. All right, so this is what we're going to learn in this week's tutorial. So before we jump into how we are protecting, the fundamental question is, what are we really trying to protect here? Over the last 4 weeks, we talked about the fact that we're trying to protect our businesses. We're trying to protect create a resilient business structure, resilient organization. But when it comes down to the actual doing the work or the implementation of this whole ideology, right? What is it that we are protecting? We are protecting assets. So assets is the term that we will hear going forward and into your real life work as we go through this whole journey and as you build your career. So just remember, we are trying to protect assets. Now, what are assets? Assets can be in many different forms and shapes. Yeah, a user or a human being can be an asset. You can have a business process or your IT process. That a process can be an asset. Data, we all know, is an important asset. Now, data could be customer information, our financial information, our profit loss information, or If you are a product organization, then obviously the information about your product, the intellectual properties, all of that comprise of data, right? Then the other type of information assets could be the softwares or the applications that you use, yeah? Or let's say the operating systems, Windows, Linux, those kind of things, the software assets. And finally, last but not the least, the hardwares, the actual appliances or actual boxes that hold all of this data and help the IT world or the technology world run. Yeah, because for everything to run, for technology to run, we put everything inside of a hardware. So it is very important to protect that as well. So here you can see that we have all these 5 different type of assets that we are trying to protect. Now, the reason why I wanted to introduce these assets or break down these asset types to you is because the control domains, as we talked about in our previous slide, all of them come together in some shape or form to protect these 5 different types of assets. Yeah. Now let's look at the key question that we need to start with. What are really the cybersecurity control domains? What does it really mean when someone says we're going to talk about cybersecurity control domains? Yeah. It is nothing but areas of focus where specific security measures or controls are implemented to protect our assets. Remember the 5 types of assets? So we talk about systems, networks, and data. So all of these controls or security measures, they come together to give us the protection that we need. And why is it important? Because it will give us the comprehensive and holistic coverage and a system to protect our assets, right? So this is why cybersecurity control domains is very important. Why? Because it gives us that structure. The whole point of governance, risk, and compliance is to have a structure. And these control domains give us that structure to actually go ahead and implement these controls. Yeah. Now let's start our journey and deep dive into understanding what these control domains are. Now, before we do that, we talked a little bit about why these are important. So these are the 4 key reasons why these control domains are important. Obviously, we talked about it providing us that structure to have a structured security strategy, how things will get implemented. Because if we try to do things without a structure, it's going to be a lot of chaos there. And cybersecurity being so vast, without a structure, we all would be like a headless chicken. We already are, but without the structure that we already have, it'll be a bigger chaos, much, much bigger chaos. So obviously we'll mitigate and reduce risks. We will be able to meet the regulatory and the compliance requirements. And if and when we are faced with security incidents or attacks or breaches, as we call them, we can recover from them much quickly. So this is the importance of the control domains. Now let's start with breaking this down one level down. Yeah. So we said we use the term control for the security measures that we're implementing, right? Now there are 3 types of controls: preventative or preventive, detective, and corrective. Now, just by the term of it, preventative or preventive controls, it means we use these type of controls or these type of security measures to stop something from happening, right? It's like putting a lock in your door so that it's difficult for people to, it's like the lock we put. Then we have detective controls. Just by the word of it, is the literal meaning. These are the security controls or measures which are used to detect when something is going wrong. Yeah. Is something going wrong? It's more like having a CCTV camera. Yeah. And then we have a corrective control. Corrective control is nothing but essentially when something has already gone wrong, how can we make sure that it doesn't happen again? Or how can we correct the situation that has already gone wrong? So remember 3 types of controls. So we'll come down to a lot more specifics on the controls, but overall, all of these 3 would be bucketed into these 3 broad categories. Okay. And a key term that we will talk a little bit in the upcoming weeks is defense in depth. Yeah, because what this means is we need to protect in depth because we cannot just control the top of it, right? It's almost like you're trying to protect something, but or let's say if you're trying to save some leftover food, just having the top covered is not going to help, right? You need to make sure that the bottom of the container is also sealed, not broken, and the container itself in itself doesn't have a breakage. So if you think your food as all of the assets that you are trying to protect, and your container and your lid as the cybersecurity controls, so you need to make sure that the from the top to the bottom is protected in a way that your food doesn't go bad. So it's as simple as that. Okay, now we can use a lot of technical jargons or technical ways of examples of understanding that, but it is as simple as that. But when you're trying to protect something, you need to make sure that it is protected from all sides. So that is as simple as defense in depth. Okay, now comes the main thing of the tutorial today or the session today. Here you see, now this control domains can be defined and categorized in a lot of different ways. And it may vary depending on who you are talking to within the industry and how they themselves classify it. But from my personal perspective, and especially for today's session, we'll focus on these 7 control domains. Now, on the left side of the screen, you see this circular cycle where it is basically, these are again another way of categorizing or bucketing the control domains, if you like, depending on the function of the controls. Now, this is taken from NIST 853 standard, where it says that the controls needs to be implemented based on where and what purpose it fulfills. So some controls are used to identify threats, some to give us protection, some to detect when things are going wrong, some are more helpful for us to respond, and some are more relevant for recovery when something has already gone wrong. Yeah, so this is another way of categorizing it. So we talked about the 3 key control types: preventive, detective, and uh, corrective. But this is another way how you can categorize your control domains. Okay, now let's look at the 7 control domains that we are going to learn and focus on in today's session. Yeah, so on the screen you've got all of this, and I don't need to read them through that. But what we will do is now we'll break these further down, and we'll talk about some examples, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the best practices that we should keep in mind when we talk about or think about each of these control domains. But the one thing that you will see in common happening throughout all of these examples and best practices, that the whole thought process of thinking everything as a life cycle, right from where something starts to where something ends. All right, so let's get started with access control. Now, access control is nothing but making sure that only those who need it have it when they need it. Yeah. So if I need access to a particular room in the house, I should have it. But let's say my child should not have access to that room. Then we need to have certain measures or security controls in place so that my child doesn't have access to that room. So that is what access control is. Yeah. Now, there are 3 key concepts within access control. And I like to use the acronym of AAA, like the AAA batteries that we use at our homes. What they stand for is, one of the A stand for authentication. So that is essentially nothing but verifying that it is really you. So if we take that example of me versus my child needing access to a room, then we can see that how do I verify that it's me and then not my child trying to pretend that it's me? So that piece is authentication. Okay. Then you have authorization. Authorization is to validate that I'm trying to do something that I'm allowed to do. So authorization asks the question, what are you allowed to do? So that is your authority. And the last is accounting. Accounting is, are you really doing what you're authorized to do, or are you trying to do something more than what you're authorized to do? So this is actually keeping track of or keeping account of what you're really doing. Okay, so remember 3 A's of access control: authentication, authorization, and accounting. All right. Now, let's look at some of the key access controls that exist within an organization or should exist in an organization. So the first one is access lifecycle management. Now, what is this? This is nothing but making sure that the access controls exist right from when I start in an organization to the day I leave an organization, right? So what would that imply? So if I join an organization today, I would be given certain level of access, right? From time to time, my role might change, my responsibilities might change, my job title might change, right? And based on that, my access would also evolve because I would need access to tools and data and new SharePoints to do my job, right? So we need a way to also validate from a time to time basis. Does Priyanka still have the right access, or does she have more, or does she have less? Yeah, less is always good in the security world, but having more access is not a great thing. So from time to time, there should be a recertification or validation process as well. Then comes the time of exit, right? Time of exit is, for example, when I leave an organization, the company should make sure that all of my access is removed and I can no longer have access to the organization's assets. Yeah. So that may include things like removing my system access, taking away my identity card, company identity card, taking away my credit cards, things like that. So all of this together form the access lifecycle management. All right. The next one is multi-factor authentication. By now, if you are already a cybersecurity enthusiast or are interested in cybersecurity world, you would have come across this word MFA or multi-factor authentication. What is this? This is nothing but using more than one thing to validate or to authenticate and authenticate yourself, right? Because my child might be able to go around one of the controls to fake it that it's me, yeah, and not her. But when I use multiple challenges, then it becomes more and more tricky. Yeah. So that is what multi-factor authentication is. And it is becoming more and more important that we implement this within our organizations. All right. The third one is role-based access control. Just by the name of the control, what this means is you should have authorization to only things that your job needs. Yeah. Now, if between me and my child, for example, I need access to a particular room in the house, but she doesn't. So because my role as a parent needs my access to that room, but she is not a parent, so she doesn't need access to that room. So that is what role-based access control means. All right. And the simplest of it, and this has been with us for eternity, but still remains a big problem, is password management. Yeah. So how strong your password is, how should you handle it? The things like you should not write the passwords on a piece of paper and stick it under your keyboard. All of these good habits, they come under password management, right? And but we need to make sure, because this is one of the most fundamental access control mechanisms for authentication, we need to make sure that we have strong password management controls. Okay, so just to summarize on this particular key access controls piece, we have these 4 controls that we should not forget about it. Yeah. Now I know that this is a lot, and like I said at the start of the tutorial, identity and access management is a specialization in itself. So if you were hoping that we would learn everything about access control in this tutorial, then I'm sorry. we would just be able to cover the tip of the iceberg here. But yes, as we go along the more sessions, and hopefully I'll be able to create more resources for you where you can come in, read, or listen to me talk a little bit more in depth of each of these different concepts. All right. So now let's move to network security. All right. So network security, what is it? It is nothing but protecting networks and the transmission. Okay. So how are we creating and protecting the network connectivity, and how is the data moving from one place to the other? That is what is network security. And what are we protecting against? We're protecting against unauthorized access and threats. Right? So we talked about access control, but access control is one way of handling. But when we talk about movable things that are moving across the network, we need to have slightly different type of controls to make sure that when things are moving, they remain protected. Okay. Now, network is a very tricky word, right? The internet is a network, is a very big network. Your home Wi-Fi is also a network. If you're connecting two computers, that is also a network, right? So when you're transferring data using Bluetooth from one phone to the other, the airdrops of the world, they are also network. Yeah. So that is why network security again is a specialization in itself. Okay. Now let's look at some of the key controls in network security. Now network security, because this takes care of how we are protecting things during its movement or transmission, we use certain devices, or we place certain devices along the path of the data that's moving, yeah, to make sure that the network remains protected throughout its journey. Yeah, otherwise it will be very, very difficult for us to make sure that things are protected during transmission. So looking at some of the key devices that we use or that exist in the network today. Yeah. So the most common device that we would typically see in most of the organizations is a firewall. Yeah. So if any organization is doing any bit of cybersecurity from a network perspective, they would typically have a firewall in place. Okay. The next one comes is an intrusion detection system, or IDS. Okay. Then we have, so what does it do? Intrusion detection system. So just by the name of it, it will detect when someone is trying to break into our network. Yeah, and we'll look into a little bit deeper on how all of these devices come together to give us the protection that we need. But I just want to first introduce the terms to you. So we talked about the firewalls, which basically filters the traffic. Yeah, it keeps the fire out. Then comes the intrusion detection system. So if an intruder is coming into our network, then it will detect. It will not save you from. So this is a detective control. It's not a preventive control. Okay. Then we have VPN, or virtual private networks. This is a mechanism of how people can connect remotely to your network. Now, I use the term people, but it could be also mean that it's an external organization trying to connect to your organization, to your network, or it could be individuals trying to connect to your network. Now, with the advance of technology, there are different ways that this can be done, but the common term that we would use for today's session's purpose is the word VPN, or virtual private network. The fourth type of device is intrusion prevention system. Okay. Now you see we have IDS and IPS. So IDS only detects when there's an intrusion. The IPS, or intrusion prevention system, will attempt to protect or stop the intrusion from happening. Yeah. So it's almost like an alarm, right? You may CCTV versus an alarm. The CCTV is an IDS, equivalent of an IDS. It will watch but not do anything. An alarm is an intrusion prevention, where it detects and then it will raise the alarm so that it kind of works as a deterrent for the intruder to our house. Okay. Now let's look at how each of these can work together. Now this is the simplistic form of a diagram, so please don't think that this is the only way that these devices can be connected. It can go very complex to very simplistic. And today, a lot of devices come with features, multiple features inbuilt within them. So sometimes you see that one appliance or one hardware piece of hardware is doing multiple roles there. But for the simplicity of today's session, we will consider each of them, each of the devices having very specific functionality. All right. So if we start from the left side where we have internet, where all most of the resources that we use exist, the social medias of the world, the Googles of the world, and any external information, right? That we are trying to protect our network typically from our external side if we kind of think through that. Obviously, we can flip the same concept internally and we can have firewalls and IDS and IPS even within the internal network, but this is kind of where we will start with, okay? Now, when we look at from the left side, we have the internet where all of these unknowns and the threats are aligned and the unknown attackers exist. They would typically come to a network and we have the router or router, depending on how you say it. This is a network device which will help you route your traffic. Yeah, where should the traffic go? It should go left, it should go right. It's more like your Google Maps, yeah, which is redirecting traffic. Now comes the security devices. So we have the firewall here. We talked about firewall is filtering the traffic, right? So firewall will say yes, Priyanka is allowed to go or not allowed to go, versus Charlie is allowed to go versus not go. So it will filter who is what kind of access or network connections is allowed to go inside the network. Okay. Then we can have an IDS to stop, or not to stop, sorry, to detect if something bad is going. Why do we have the IDS behind the firewall? Because the attackers are quite clever. They would typically use something, a mechanism that is under a cover of like, yes, this looks like an allowed kind of a traffic. Yeah, a very common example is the domain name resolution or DNS. Yeah, so it works on port 53. Now, port 53 is a very common port and people need access to that. And it is usually allowed across the networks. But when an attacker wants to do that, it can use that as a hiding mechanism to get into the network. So it will get filtered, yeah, but the IDS would be able to then look at the filtered data and see, okay, is it all good or is there an intruder hiding between all of that, right? And it can alert the different security operations team or the team which are monitoring the attacks, okay? Now, here on the right side of the diagram, you see the IDS will then kind of connect back to the internal network because once it passes through the IDS and the network, it will show that. Okay. Now, here's a small difference there. So the diagrams, the top and the bottom of the screen looks very similar. The only difference is the intrusion detection system. It does not have to be necessarily inline. Now, remember this term, yeah? Just bear with me. I will talk about a little bit of terms because we are going one level down as we go through the whole series. So when I use the word inline, it essentially just means in the line. Yeah. So when you put a security control in the line of where transmission or where the data traffic is going, it is called an inline control, right? Now, IDS, because this is just detecting, it can stay in a parallel mode here, right? So you might have one way where your data traffic is flowing, but you can just have an IDS just sort of tapping into here and looking at the traffic because detection is just looking at the traffic and seeing if something is going wrong, right? Now, so IDS doesn't have to be inline because it is not stopping. So it can run in parallel, yeah? But IPS as a control needs to be inline. Why? Because it is protecting or preventing. right? How do you stop something from going in if you're not in the line, right? If you have to stop someone from getting inside the house, you'll have to be able to stop or close the door, right? So you are in the way. So IPS is an inline device because it is protecting or preventing that intrusion from happening. Whereas IDS can, because it's just tapping into the traffic, it can stay out of the actual path of the traffic. Okay, so that is where our network security devices exist. Now, I know that depending on how your organization has actually structured the teams, the network security team might be looking at other tools such as web application firewalls and stuff. But conceptually, web application firewall stays within the application security world, which we will come in a little bit in a moment. Yeah. So now let's look at the best practices, some of the best practices. All right. The first one is basic, but very, very important. Now, a lot of organizations, and especially the lot of the bigger organizations, they don't do it well, is network segmentation. And definitely the smaller ones, because they don't think that way. They just put everything in the same segment. Yeah. What does network segment mean? Network segmentation is nothing but you break the network into different pieces essentially. And you build a category saying, okay, this type of things will exist here, this type of things will exist here. Why this is important? Because if, let's say, if an attacker gets into your network, right? If you have an open door policy, or if the network is all one, then it can get to anywhere. But the moment you have broken down the network in a logical fashion, it will have to cross more boundaries, which makes it more and more difficult for the attackers. Because remember, the key purpose of all of these controls is to make it more and more difficult for the attackers to freely roam around and get to what they want to do, right? Or do the bad stuff. So network segmentation is a very fundamental but useful way, or an easy way to stop an attacker to just come in and walk around. Yeah. So just think about this. If you have an open living room and kitchen, yeah, if someone gets into your living room, they can get access to your kitchen, they can get access to your refrigerator, they can steal your food. But if your living room and your kitchen is separate and your refrigerator is locked in the kitchen and you have an access control there, then your risk of someone stealing the food is reduced to a lot of extent, right? So it is exactly the same concept within a network as well. So network segmentation is very, very important and fundamental thing that you can implement. Okay. Now you can segment it using the controls around routers and switches, or you can have firewalls. But breaking your network down into smaller pieces goes a long way to protecting against the attacks. Okay. The next thing is we talked about routers or routers and switches. So these are the network devices or the IT equipments that help the traffic to move around your organization. Yeah. So if you're thinking, or if you're trying to understand how does my the email that I write from my computer goes to my colleague's computer, then all of this technology, it actually, these routers and switches, they will do their job from a technology perspective. So, which means that securing these particular devices is very, very important again, right? Now, something that we need to do is, as part of GRC, is continual check, right? So we have to keep reviewing. So vulnerability scans is again very, very important to make sure to go and keep checking and reviewing that are my routers and switches secure? Is my network segmentation, do I have the right protections within my routers and switches? So vulnerability scan will help us understand that are my routers and switches protected enough? Then we have something called zero trust principle. Now, it's not something new, But right now in the industry, this is catching up speed because people have done a lot of things, and because the attack surface is getting more and more complex, people are starting to implement something called as zero trust, which is essentially taking the approach that I don't trust you until I can validate you. Yeah. So that is a zero trust principle. Now, obviously, there are different elements to the zero trust. There's some network elements, there's some application elements, and there's some user elements. But overall, from a network perspective, you have a zero trust principle, which goes very well hand in hand with the network segmentation control. Yeah. So these are some of the best practices that we have. Now, something that I do not have on the slide, but again, it comes into securing the routers and switches is a term called hardening. Hardening is nothing but making sure that you stop any services that are not needed, you reduce the amount of access that you have, and you use a more secure version of the software that your devices can support. Yeah. So it is basically configuring your devices in a secure way is called hardening. Okay. Now the details of which, again, like I said, each of these is a specialization in itself. So you could spend all of your career just working in network security, just learning about this and finding out innovative ways of securing your network. But essentially, these are some of the best practices that you have to keep in mind. Okay. Now moving on to endpoint and device security. All right. What does it mean? What does this domain do? This is about securing the devices that connect to our network. So we talked a little bit about the devices that we connect to build the networks, which is routers and switches, and then devices to secure the network, which is firewalls, IDS, IPS, VPNs, things like that, right? But we don't work as end users, we don't work on routers and switches or firewalls. We work on laptops, we work on mobiles, tablets, right? Or servers if you are an IT administrator. So those are called endpoints and devices. The endpoints are what the end users would use, typically the laptops, desktops, mobile devices, tablets, things like that. Those are classed as endpoints. And then the other kind of device you would have in the network is the servers. Yeah, servers is typically only managed by IT or people who would have some responsibility to manage some kind of technology. Yeah, centralized technology. Now, what are some of the examples of controls that we can use? So because this is around endpoint, right? So one of the key controls is endpoint detection and response. So this is around things like antivirus, things like how can you detect what something is going wrong, right? So it is about protecting your uh, endpoint device. It, like I said, the laptops, tablets of the world, mobile devices of the world, and the server. So you implement things like antivirus, things like you're collecting the logs from the devices just to detect if something is going wrong or to find out what is happening on our devices, right? So most of the organizations would have an EDR solution. So the endpoint detection and response is also called EDR, Echo Delta Romeo. All right. The next one is mobile device management. Mobile device management, this is again a practice and a specialization in itself. What it does is this is a framework where you define the controls, and this is mix of technical and process level controls, where you define how are you going to let the mobile devices connect. So your laptops, mobiles, tablets, not laptops, sorry, usually mobile device management applies to mobile devices like the phones and tablets that we have. How do we know that which phone is an authorized phone versus which is an authorized tablet versus not? How do we make sure that the controls we can apply secure those devices? So that is called mobile device management. Yeah. So there is a lot of adoption there, and there's a lot of innovation that's happening there. Because why? Now, as a user, I tend to use more and more of my mobile devices than a laptop or a desktop. Desktop is almost kind of gone, except for people who work all the time from their offices or all the time from a particular location. But this brings us to secure, bring your own device, or secure BYOD controls. Yeah, because why? Now, with this whole explosion of working remotely, right? Or working flexibly, people using external parties a lot more than before, or people looking at external specializations primarily. So a lot of the devices that gets used to do business is not owned or controlled by the organization themselves, right? So how do we secure that whole thing? So it is again a specialization in itself. It's called bring your own device. Okay, so there are different ways of how you can control those external devices, or how, in what situations would you let them connect to your network. So this is again where a bit of the concept of zero trust principle comes into play. Okay, now the most common or the easiest of the controls that we all should have on our devices, whether it's personal or organizational, is device encryption. Yeah, most of the modern devices support encryption. What is encryption? Encryption is nothing but essentially covering up a particular data or what is stored in that particular device in a way that it's not understand, it's jumbled up in a way that it is not easily readable by someone if someone just gets hold of it. Yeah, it's almost like I saw a video the other day. So encryption is almost like putting your data into a blender and mixing it with a hash so that uh, and then you add some salt on it, but it makes it very difficult for an attacker or an external party to read it if you don't have the key to open the door. Okay, so that is a device encryption. Now, all of the specific control types, although they're under the same domain of endpoint and device security, they are specializations in themselves. There are people who specialize in encryption, there are people who specialize in bring your own device control. But as the industry evolves, in most organizations, you'll see that you'll have a combined responsibility to oversee or take on responsibilities around these areas. Okay. Now, what are some of the best practices? Yeah. So the type of best practices look very similar from the network to the endpoint and device security, but it's what changes is the details and the asset that is impacted. Remember, at the start of the tutorial, we talked about those 5 types of assets, and this is where we talk about the soft OS operating system type of assets, the device types of assets, the hardware type of assets, right? So we talked about so some of the best practices. The first and foremost is hardening or securely configuring your devices. Yeah. So that is what hardening means. You harden. When you get a new laptop or a new device, it is open to everything because the device manufacturers, they give you a lot of creative flexibility of what you are allowed to do with that particular device. But depending on the organization, you may or may not need to use all of the features and functionalities. So in hardening, you basically shut down or stop what you don't need and you only run what you need. Okay. Now comes the hardware security. Okay. This is often an overlooked, at some point in time, it was a well practiced control. But as things are evolving, our focus is moving more and more to the application because obviously things are moving to cloud. But hardware security is, again, a specialization in itself and should be considered very, very carefully. Why? Because if you think of an example, right? Let's take an example here to understand why it's important. So let's we took an example of someone getting into the house to steal our jewelry, right? Valuables and jewelry. And we also talked about putting them in a safe. Now think about this. If the data that we have is the jewelry, and the devices that we are putting it in is the safe. Yeah. What good would it do if my jewelry is well locked in the safe, but the safe is in a place where anyone can just take it and run away with it, right? Then it is not as good as what we would need to keep the jewelry or the data safe, right? So that's where the hardware security comes. So this is nothing but making sure that the hardware where you're putting all of your data is safe. Okay. The third is, again, making sure that because the devices come with systems, running software like operating systems and stuff like that, we need to make sure that they are updated and patched properly. Yeah. And for those who have subscribed to some kind of cybersecurity newsletters, might have come across things like China is trying to inject something into the hardwares of American devices as an attack, or uh, a particular brand of devices is not safe to use in particular situations, things like that. And this is not me again talking against any specific country or anything, but these are the things that you read in newspapers and articles. So that, and also in certain cases, people would run away with the ATM machines, things like that. So just think about that. People just run away with the hardware, right? So protecting the hardware is also very, very important. Okay. Now, the third is, so patching and updates is basically nothing but making sure that whatever is in the hardware is also updated, and if there are any loopholes, patch is nothing but, remember, when we um, get a cut on our skin, we put a band-aid, right? So that is patching. So that's why, so these devices, they run softwares, they run applications, right? So we need to make sure that all of that is patched and all of that is updated to make sure that we are not exposing ourselves knowingly or unknowingly to open issues or open problems. Yeah. Now, a key control is backup and restore. Now, this is backup and restore is actually a corrective control, or a between preventive and corrective control. Why? Because we have, things will go wrong. Yeah. Like I always say, things will always go wrong. Not always, sorry. Things will go wrong. But when things go wrong, all of this stuff that we are doing, it will help us to recover faster. So backup and restore is one of those controls that helps us recover faster. So for example, let's take an example of a ransomware attack, yeah, or your device just crashing. So if those kind of things happen, and if we have to recover from that kind of incident, if our device is not accessible, yeah, or my device breaks, where will I get that data? Where will I find all of that information? So backup and restore is that control wherein we essentially take a backup is nothing but creating a copy of the data in a different place. Yeah. So it's like you have your photos and images and everything on your phone, but you're also saving it on Google Drive or iCloud Drive, depending on the device you're using. That is the backup. So that even if you lose your mobile phone, or it falls in water, or someone locks, or someone gets hold of your phone, you still have access to that, your pictures and images, and you can still restore them to a new phone. So this is what backup and restore means. All right. Now there is another common control that we just talked about called vulnerability scans. Now vulnerability scans is nothing but it is a control that we use for reviewing how good our controls are, what we are doing. It's a point in time check to see is our device protected? Are these secure enough, right? So that is what a vulnerability scan control means. Okay. So We are almost halfway through. So if at this point you want to pause the video and take a 20-second break, you might want to do that, because I know it is quite a loaded session today. But if not, if you're happy to continue, let's continue with our next domain, application security. Okay. Now, application security has two goals in mind. Okay. So one is to ensure that the applications are built and maintained. So we talked about the concept of thinking through that whole life cycle, right? So right from where it starts, so building, to maintaining, and to the time it exits the whole system, right? So one of the goals of application security is to make sure that the applications are built and maintained in a secure manner or with security in mind. And the next goal is to actually protect the applications, which means the code of the application, the actual code that the application is running on, the availability of the application, the connections that are going in and out of the application, and the actual functionality of the application so that it does what it is supposed to do, right? From unauthorized access and threats. All right. So these are the two key goals of application security. Now, what are some of the examples? How can we secure applications? So the first and foremost is, because applications are built on code, we need to make sure that we are building and writing the codes in a secure manner. We are actually including all the different ways of keeping the application security in the code itself, right? And the code itself does not have any loopholes for the attackers to come and easily leverage and break the application. Okay. Now, the next one is application firewalls. Yeah. We talked about firewalls in the network security controls, but because the applications work at a different level, we have something called application firewalls. So the network firewalls and the application firewalls have a small difference in them. Now, the more modern firewalls, they do have the capability to combine both of the capabilities, but traditionally, network firewalls will only look at the network traffic, like what is the source and destination of the traffic, what ports are it trying to talk to. Okay. But you have the application firewalls, which looks at what is that particular request trying to do. Am I trying to call someone, right? My source and destination might be exactly the same. So for example, when I'm talking to my child and consider me as the source and my child as the destination, my network security control would be only securing the communication between me and my child so that someone else is not overhearing, right? But the application security control would actually protect if I'm talking about her studies, if I'm talking about a fun planning, or if I'm talking about an outing, it looks at the what is it that actually is happening. So that is that is where the application firewalls vary. But job wise, it also does the same thing of filtering traffic, but filtering application type of traffic. Yeah, application traffic. Then the next one is, we talked about the updates. Yeah. Now, because these are softwares, they come with new features, they come with new fixes, right? So the software manufacturers or the uh, companies that create that particular application, they will come up with new features every now and then, or when they find out that there is something wrong with their software or application, they would issue some updates. So it is again a very important control to make sure that our softwares remain updated. You should not still be running a Windows NT in your environment. Yeah. Now, a good practice there, right? Because the whole concept of patches and updates and all of this stuff is quite effort intensive as well. Okay. Because if you think of our laptops, if we have to keep updating our laptops every day, There's going to be very, very troublesome, right? But if we have to update it every, let's say, a month, it's not as difficult, but it's more manageable for us, and we can remember, yeah, and better plan for it. Because typically software updates require a system reboot. Now, when we take it into the context of a personal device, it's much easier because I can plan when I'm not working. Yeah, when I can plan these updates when I'm not working. But when it comes to an organizational level, it becomes a little bit more tricky to plan because the IT team needs to make sure that the systems are available for most part of the time. Yeah, or what they call as 99.9% availability. That's kind of the norm right now. So that makes getting or planning for these restart downtimes a little tricky, but it is an essential control. So we need to somehow bake this into the practice to keep the software applications updated, okay, or the application softwares updated. Now we talked about building the secure code, right? And we talked about application firewalls and software updates. But how do we really verify that all of this is actually working? So we do that using security testing. Okay. Now, this is a term that can include a lot of different tasks or activities actually. Some of the terms you may have already heard, like penetration testing or secure code testing. So it in the term security testing is a specialization in itself again, and can include a lot of different tasks. So it can be only testing the code, specific code, or it can be testing the code with the device, how it works. So for example, a similar code, does it work how does it work on an Android phone versus how does it work on an iPhone, things like that, or how does it work on a Windows machine versus how does it work on an Apple machine, things like this. So all of that comprises of security testing. And plus, so you could have a code testing, you could have penetration testing, you could have vulnerability scan of the applications. Yeah, vulnerability scan, just by the name of it, it will check for the weaknesses in the application. So that is where the security testing is a key application control as well. So this is how you validate and verify that your applications are really secure. Okay. And you can also check for the software updates. Now, in terms of best practices, there are two key terms that I want to introduce to you today. Okay. So the first one is SDLC. Now, there are two full forms of this. Yeah. One is the software development lifecycle, which is more famous or commonly used in the IT world. But when we talk about cybersecurity, the right way of using the right full form is secure development lifecycle. Yeah. What does it mean? It means that you think about security right from the start when you start thinking about building an application, right? Why? Because if you want to inject security in the middle, right, it is going to be very, very difficult. Yeah, it's almost like think about cooking a food. Yeah, when you have all the spices available to you and you have planned the recipe and you have everything available, it's more smoother and it's much more easier to cook that particular food. Yeah, but if you start cooking the food without thinking of certain spices or start thinking of certain ingredients, and only midway you say, ah, I forgot to put this. Just imagine how chaotic, how messy it becomes. And then you don't know what that would mean. Is the food already cooked? I should have put that at the start. Will it leave a bad taste on the mouth now? So you see, if you compare that with a secure code or an application, if you have to put uh, security controls after the application is already working, it can make your life very, very difficult. So the secure development lifecycle or SDLC can actually help you reduce a lot of the headache and chaos that you might otherwise take if you just go with building the code in an insecure manner. Okay. Now the next term, and which is more modern and more, I would say, in trend right now, is a term called DevSecOps. It is nothing but the amalgamation or the combination of three terms: development, security, and operations. It is basically combining all of these three and making sure that you have built uh, security into all of these different things, and you've combined all of this stuff, right? Now, definitely, we talked about the SDLC, or considering security as part of the development lifecycle. Then we do the security checks and we hand it off to the operations world. And even in the operations world, we have the operational security controls in place. So that's a simple explanation of DevSecOps. But again, SDLC, while it's a more common way of kind of, it has been in the industry for a while, but the whole DevSecOps, it's a specialization and expertise in itself. So if any one of you here is in any way interested in application security, then DevSecOps might be a great way for you to specialize. And this is a very high in demand job as well. So you see how as we are going through the control domains, we are realizing that there are so many different things that people can specialize within cybersecurity. But because this is a GRC course, for you, it is important to understand these concepts and see how we can kind of leverage this to do the job as a GRC expert better, right? You may not know how to code, but you need to understand the concept that you need to build a secure code, okay? So that you can actually go and talk to an application security expert and ask them that, okay, what kind of guidance, what kind of specific guidance can we provide to the IT teams or the developers so that the applications are secure, or network is secure, or the devices are secure, right? Typically in an organization, you would have, depending on the size of the organization, you may have one or more than one people taking care of each of these domains. One team or more, or people, depending again on the size of the organization. So the GRC team usually have the ability to leverage these technical experts, but as the GRC expert, you need, or the GRC analyst, you need to make sure that you understand these domains and you have sufficient knowledge so that when the technical teams talk to each other, or when you can detect when things are not going in the right direction from a conversation perspective, right? So that's kind of where I would say. Now, the next control domain is a very up and coming, and the weightage on this one is increasing by the day. What is it? Is the data protection and privacy. Now, this whole world, the amount of data is increasing like crazy. Yeah. So I read somewhere that the total amount of data that was created from the start of IT, which is maybe late 1800s, up until kind of early 2000s, if you take all of that data, and if we are generating that equal amount of data in 2 to 3 days now. So just imagine you have like almost a century worth of data to 2 days. So we're generating that kind of data today, right? So this particular domain, it takes care of protecting the sensitive data and the important data, so that one, we are protecting the data, and second, we are compliant to all of the different regulations that we have, the data protection, privacy regulations. Now, an interesting angle to this is that these days, when I speak to most of the business leaders or the expert CISOs, they say that my business, I am a people business. I'm not a bank. I'm not a burger company. I'm not a food business. I'm not a clothing company. I'm a people business, right? Depending on the industry they are in. So they would say, I'm not a food company, but I'm a people's company, right? What that means is essentially the data that they have on people, that is gold to them. Yeah. They use that to analyze our habits, what we like, what we don't like. They use it to personalize our experience with them, right? Now, you can only personalize an experience if you know what I like and what I don't like, right? And how do you know that as an organization? By keeping more and more data for me. Now, that is kind of a double-edged sword, if you like, because as an individual, I would want my data to be private. But again, the same person, I love personalized experience. So it is about choosing where to balance as an individual, but as an organization, it is equally kind of important that we are protecting the data that we are capturing, and we are maintaining the privacy of the individuals. Okay, why? Because this will build trust and resilience within the business. The customers and the employees will trust us, and it will make our company more and more resilient. Okay, now comes, look at the some of the controls in this domain. Yeah, sorry. Some of the controls, and again, I will create some specific resources outside of this video because this is a very up and coming topic, and I think everyone should understand this, whether or not you are in GRC or are you in a technical control domain. But this is something that every user should also understand. Yeah. So the first one is data classification. Now, data classification, just by the name of it, you need to have a mechanism of classifying or categorizing the data that you have, right? Because you may have a lot of data. Yeah, you may have information that you would have gotten from Google searches. You may have data that is your customer data. You may have your finance data, right? Not all data is the same. Things that you found from Google search doesn't need the same amount of protection like your financial data or your customer data, right? So you need a mechanism to classify and categorize data. Why is this important? Because, like I said, not everything needs the same level of protection. And if you're trying to do the same level of protection for everything, then that would not be a great and efficient way of doing things. Okay. All right. So talking about doing the things, the next key control is secure data handling. Now, this is again one of those life cycle controls within this area, data protection and privacy. That you should, what secure data handling means, that you should protect the data right from the time you collect it to the time you delete it, destroy it, or no longer need it. Yeah. So, right from collection to the destruction, you need to handle the data securely. Okay. The next one comes data ownership. Now, let's talk about why is data ownership important, right? So we talked about categorizing or classifying data. We talked about the life handling data securely through the life cycle, right? But who is supposed to do that? We need to give that job to someone, right? So that's where the data ownership comes. Now, the data ownership is actually about accountability. It is not about who is doing the security of it, but it is about who is accountable to keep the data secure. Okay. Now, what does that mean in real life? That if you talk about, for example, a family, right? Now, the parent of the family, if you have both a father and a mother or a single parent, doesn't matter. So the parent is accountable to keep the child safe. Okay. Now they can do it themselves. They can hire a security guard. They can hire a nanny, or they can lock the child, right? So there are different ways of how a parent can keep the child safe. But at the end of the day, they are still accountable for child safety, right? So that is exactly what data ownership is. So you own the data, you make sure that that data is safe. How you do it, who does the job, that is secondary. But the data ownership makes sure that someone is actually taking care of that safety of the data. Okay. Now comes data loss prevention. Yeah. I just mentioned, or we talked about the whole business concept of the businesses being a people business or data business, right? So what that means is when we lose data, we lose business, we lose insights, right? And if I don't have insight, I can't personalize the experience. So, and plus, it breaks the trust that the employees and the customers have on the particular company. That is where data loss prevention is very, very important. Now, practically, the data loss prevention is can be a mix of process and technology control. The technology control can exist within the endpoint and device security as well. But from my perspective, I like to class it under the data protection and privacy control. Okay. But these are some of the examples of data protection and privacy controls that we can implement to keep our data safe and maintain the privacy of the data. Now, what are some of the best practices that I recommend? The first is for us to make sure that we are applying the controls, we need to know where is our data. Yeah, so we have classified, we have given ownership. But if we don't know where are we storing what kind of data, so if we don't know where are we storing our customer data, or if we don't know where are we storing our financial data, it's going to be very, very difficult to put any kind of control on that, right? So having a data inventory is very important because it tells us this is where I have a particular type of data. So it tells us about the data type that we have, and it also tells us about where is that data. Okay, that helps us to prioritize everything that we need to do. Okay, and you will hear as we go along the future weeks or the upcoming weeks, you will hear me use the word prioritize a lot more because we need to keep, like everything else, cybersecurity practical. And we can only do that by prioritizing things. Okay. So data inventory. We need to have an inventory of what data we have and where is it. The next one is data security posture management. Now this term is rather new in the industry, but have been practiced for a while now, at least by the ones where we have mature security practices. What does this mean? It means that this is essentially nothing but a framework that will make sure that your data is safe and you understand its security posture. Okay, so this is a whole it's about managing the posture of your data security. Okay, so that is another best practice. So this is actually a framework that needs to be embedded. Now, we do a lot of different things, but this gives us that structure to make sure that we understand how all the different pieces line up together to make the data secure and safe. Okay. Okay. Now, when we talk about aligning all the different things we do, right? And we also talked about data protection being a mix of people, process, and technology kind of a control, right? We need to make sure who is doing what. So stakeholder engagement is going to be super important as a best practice because we'll have data ownership, we will have IT people running or cybersecurity people running some of the technology controls. We will have some processes defined to do stuff like how do we create an inventory, how do we maintain an inventory, things like that, right? So you have a lot of need to manage stakeholders' expectations and also create that capability where they can ask questions, provide feedback, and maybe need to make them aware around the different expectations. All right. And another best practice that I recommend is to do a regular risk and control assessment. Yeah. Now, risk and control assessment and posture management go hand in hand because the risk and control assessments help us understand where our exposure is and how well protected we are. And it feeds directly to the framework of data security posture management, and it triggers all the different things that we need to do. Now, data we talked about, and we kind of drew a parallel of data being the jewelry and it being inside the safe, right? So data will just understanding where the risks around the data are will help us to also determine, do we need to protect our hardware, IT hardware, or laptops or desktops, or do we need to spend more on, let's say, network security, or should we invest more on application security? So this is quite central in itself, and data security posture management will get more and more momentum as we go through the next couple of years. Okay. Now we have incident management. Yeah. So we talked about the networks, we talked about the application, the devices. Now, and we also talked about keeping the data safe. But this is life, right? Things will go wrong, accidents will happen, incidents will happen, attacks will happen. Yeah. Now, incident management is that control which actually helps us to reduce the impact. So just think about this, right? When something goes wrong, there is an impact. How do we, one of the key skills is, or key requirements of cybersecurity is, how do we reduce the risk of, how do we reduce the impact when something goes wrong? Yeah. So that is exactly the role of incident management. Okay. And usually there is a person or a team responsible to run the incident management. Yeah. Now, this is a practice in itself, and it is very difficult to find really good people who do good incident management. Yeah, there are a lot of people who can coordinate well. There are a lot of people who can run around, but there are only few people who can really do good incident management. Yeah, because it is about understanding the impact. It is about responding quickly. It is about recovery, right? So, which means you need to have an understanding of all the different control domains as well if you are in incident management. And again, I'll come back to focusing on the fact that understanding the domains doesn't mean that you are an expert in every single domain. If you somehow have attained expertise on most of the domains, it's great. And I really applaud you. But the chances are you would be only able to expertise or specialize in one or two domains at best. Yeah. But you should aim to understand or grab the key concepts of each of the domains at least. Okay. Or know who you can talk to leverage. Okay. The power of cybersecurity is actually leveraging our stakeholders. Okay. Because it is impossible to know everything. So leverage your stakeholders. Okay. So coming back to incident management. So the incident management controls, there can be many, but from my perspective and for the purposes of this session, I want us to focus on these 5 things, right? So the first one is detecting and monitoring when has something gone wrong. So first is to understand, do we have an incident in place? So that is where detection and monitoring comes in play. And this is a primary role of Security Operations Center or SOC. Okay, where they would monitor the events, monitor the logs, use tools such as SIEM to detect and monitor if there's an incident happening. All right. The next is very crucial, and this is the master plan of what will you do if an incident happens, who will you engage, and what kind of recovery plans can we expect to invoke. Invoke means to start or trigger. Okay. So incident response plan is very important, which basically essentially tells us that what will we do and who will do what if an incident happens or when an incident happens. So that's your incident response plan. Okay. The next key control is a root cause analysis. Okay, this is very, very important because when something goes wrong, it is very important for us to understand what went wrong. And why is it important? Because this is root cause analysis is a corrective type of a control. Why is it important? Because we don't want this thing to happen again, right? When something has gone wrong, we need to understand what happened and how can we prevent it from happening again. So that is where root cause analysis comes into play. Okay. The next one is cyber insurance. Now, when things go wrong, right, we would need some kind of coverage. We may need some money to actually fix the problems, or we may need money to pay some penalties to the government or to our customers or to the affected employees, things like that, right? So that is where the cyber insurance comes into play. Okay, so this is another way of, so this is a response mechanism, cyber insurance. And now this is an evolving market, and the insurance providers are trying to work more closely with the industry to understand how can they reduce their own risk, because they know cyber attacks happen and will happen. It's just about them reducing their own risk. And also, as the cybersecurity industry, we are also learning what and when do we really need cybersecurity insurance for. Okay, so that's another key incident management control. And the final one is forensics. So this is a highly specialized field. Okay, now forensics is nothing but an expert which will look at the chain of events. Okay, okay, and there is a term called custody. Okay, chain of custody. So it will look at what happened. It will look at all the events that led to the incident from happening. For example, a ransomware attack happened. Yeah. So a chain of events will look something like a user received an email, they clicked on the link in the email, there was a pop-up, they clicked OK on the pop-up, then this happened, and then that happened, and we see that the ransomware has actually locked a particular system. So this is your chain of events, and the forensics team or forensics expert will look at all of this chain of events and making sure that the custody is not broken, because it will make sure that the evidence that we submit or that we review as part of the root cause analysis is not tampered with. Okay, because if the evidence is tampered with, then we cannot really know with confidence that this is why the incident happened, right? So that is where the forensics becomes important. Okay, so all these five things come together to make the incident management controls. Okay, and this is something that you can expertise in. And for those who might be thinking, okay, what next after GRC? Maybe this could be a very great domain for you to move into. Yeah, because again, like I said, this may or may not need you to be very technically hands-on, but it gives you a good mix and visibility into a lot of the other domains and a lot of understanding about the domains, because we are doing all of the control domains to typically prevent incidents from happening, or to detect that it has happened, and to correct when something has gone wrong and prevent the incident from happening again. So this is a domain that kind of touches all the different domains very, very often, similar to GRC. Now GRC would set up the rules of the game. Incident management will basically, when something goes wrong, it will help us to make sure that we are we remain protected, and and understand what can we do better. So incident management will give a feedback into the GRC, or it should give the feedback into the GRC function that these are the new ways of doing things, or we should improve a certain way of doing things, a certain kind of process or policy or standard, right? So incident management and GRC can be linked very, very closely, and GRC team should and must talk to the incident management team on a regular basis. Okay. Now, we talked about the controls. Now, let's look at some of the best practices that I always preach that an organization should have. So, the first one is playbooks and automation. Now, the underlying fact to this is to make the lives of the incident managers more efficient and more proactive, right? Playbook is nothing, but that is your process that if a ransomware attack happens, these are the 5 things I will do. Or if I lose a customer data, these are the 4 things I will do to investigate. So playbook is basically your process of what you will do when a particular incident happens. Yeah. Now, because of the sheer volume of attacks and incidents and things go happening wrong, or things that needs investigation, right? We need to focus on automation. So automating what we can do. Okay. So for example, if there is a standard list of questions that we can ask every time a particular thing happens, then we should look at automating that piece using solutions or codes or whatever that may look like. Yeah. And so that it saves the human time and they can focus on investigating the more complex situation or try to find out what is not standard. Okay. Then next is stakeholder engagement. Just like data protection and privacy, in incident management, when something goes wrong, you need to work around a lot of different teams within an organization. You may need to talk to lawyers, you may need to talk to communication people who would basically make sure the messaging is correct outside the organization, or you may need to contact your management, you may need to contact your IT teams, a lot of different stakeholders, right? So stakeholder engagement is very, very important in incident management. If you don't know who you need to engage, then it's going to be super difficult to reduce the impact and even recover from that incident, right? And that's where the next 2 best practices come in play. So we had talked about the backup and restore in the endpoint and device security control domain, right? But this is a very, very important control in the incident management as well. Because why? Because when things go wrong, we would want to still recover from that situation, right? And how can we do that? We can bring our data back or bring our system back from our backup copy or the copy of the data, right? The next one is testing and validating. So here you see, we talked about having an incident response plan. Yeah. But what good is that plan if we don't have the confidence that it will work when we need it to? Yeah. So that is where testing and validating the plan is very, very important. There is a more commonly used industry term. It is called tabletop exercise. But tabletop exercise is nothing but a way of testing and validating your plan. So basically, you simulate an incident, or you basically create an incident-like situation and you test out if your plan will work. You test out whether your playbooks really work. You test out if your stakeholders will really know what to do when something like this happens, right? That is where the testing and validation of the plan is very, very important. And my personal recommendation and suggestion, a request rather, to anyone is that we should aim to test and validate our incident plan, management plan, or response plan at least once annually. Take your top 3 risks and test out the incident response plan. If you have been hit with ransomware, or if your industry is very prone to ransomware, then you should make sure that you're testing out a situation. You create a fake use case, like you have been hit by ransomware, what would you do? That is about testing and validating the plans. All right. So that brings us to the last domain here for this session. It is called business continuity and disaster recovery. So we just talked about the incident management. Yeah, it is about reducing the impact and recovering as fast as we can. Now, we cannot do all of that stuff without another specializing domain helping them. Yeah, because incident management is more responsible for executing what is known, what is in plan, right? But just think about an organization. There are so many processes, there are so many different people, so many different things that are happening, right? And that is where this particular domain of business continuity and disaster recovery comes in play. Okay. These two go hand in hand, and people use these terms interchangeably. But in my mind, I see them very differently. Yeah. Now, for me, business continuity planning is nothing but it is the strategy of how do you continue to do business when an incident has happened or when something goes wrong. Okay. It may be doing things in a different way, or it may be uh, changing certain things, or it may be saying like, okay, if something goes wrong, I will only do one thing and not five things. So it is a strategy of how do you continue to remain in business when something goes wrong. That is your business continuity planning. Okay, it is about continuity. Whereas disaster recovery is that when something has already happened or disaster has hit, how do you recover from that? Okay, for example, if a ransomware attack has happened, do you have the right backup copies to recover? Do you have to pay ransomware? Do you have to do this? So when an incident happens, there are always two things, right? One is how do you recover from that incident, and how do you still continue to do your work and do your business while you're trying to recover to your normal state, yeah, or what we call as is, right? So that's where I see the difference between business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. Okay, so one is about continuing the business, and the second is to recover from the disaster so that you can bring things back to normal. Okay, and I can see that Zoom is trying to do its magic. There you go, AI. And I tried to do that, it was showing fireworks. But yeah, that's effectively the purpose of business continuity. So the fireworks carry on while we're trying to recover from the effects of a firework. Let's call it that. Yeah. And on the right here on screen, you see the four different stages of disaster recovery. So you're prepared for when a disaster to happen. Yeah. So you are prepared. For example, you know that when you travel on an aeroplane, it has the exit gates, it has the life jackets, right? So that is about preparedness, so that when something goes wrong, you have the uh, safety jackets available, and the you'll get the instructions of what to do and how to use them before we fly, right? So that's about preparedness. Then you know how to respond to it when a disaster hits. Yeah, you would have seen the instructions or heard the instruction that if you need to use the life jacket or the safety jacket, you blow air into it or you pull the plugs. So that is about responding when disaster happens. Yeah. Then comes the disaster recovery. So that if you exit the plane, how do you recover the people from that particular situation? And then you have the business continuity. Business continuity can be triggered in parallel with disaster recovery, and it usually does. But when something goes wrong, you still have to give that confidence to your employees and customers that even in the event of a disaster, I can run the business. Yeah, so that is about this whole business continuity and disaster recovery. Now, how you do this? This is a slightly different way of explaining this than what I did with the other domains, but I thought it will be useful for you to understand. how this is done and how you can do it well, right? So the first one is risk assessment. It always starts with, because business continuity and disaster is a risk, right? How do you continue business when something has gone wrong? So we have to understand those situations of what are we calling as disaster. Is my system not being available a disaster, or is my office not being able accessible or available a disaster, or if my CEO dies, that's a disaster? What is the definition of a disaster? So that comes from a risk assessment, the definition of disasters, right? Then once you've defined the disaster definition, you do a business impact analysis. Okay, what is this? It is basically nothing that you now have a definition of disaster. Then you understand and analyze that if something happens, what how does it impact my business? So that is your business impact analysis. Okay? Now, once you know what your disaster is and what the impact could look like, you go on to defining the strategies for recovery, or the recovery strategies. Now, this is where you would define that if my CEO dies, this is going to be the impact. I need to have a plan for an interim CEO, for example, right? So that is your recovery strategy. Or let's say if natural disaster or your office not being available is your definition of disaster, and you say that, oh, if my office is not available, office building, then my people can work from home. So that's your recovery strategy, for example. Yeah. And finally, similar to incident management or incident response control, you need to train your people on all of these strategies. You need to make them aware, and you need to test the plan that it will actually work when the disaster happens, or if the disaster happens, right? So it is very, very important that we do a good job of identifying what is a disaster. We understand the impact of the disaster, and we have a way to recover from that disaster, and that we are communicating and testing it with our stakeholders. So every time, so irrespective of what control it is, every time you define a plan, it is very important that we are communicating it to the people, and we are testing the plan. Very, very important. Now, the testing the plan is where most organizations get it wrong, and that is where, when the incident really happens, they don't know what to do. Yeah, so it's very, very important that it doesn't stay in a document, closed document, but the people that needs to be involved in that process, or recovery process, or incident response process, actually know that they have a role to do. Okay, so that is about business continuity and disaster recovery. All right, so that brings us to the end of the domains. Now, irrespective of the domains, okay, there are certain things that you should practice generally when you're implementing the controls, or when, as a GRC analyst, you are guiding the people to implement the controls. The first is the review cycle. We talked about this on all the last 4 weeks session, and also in today's session, that it is not just enough to define or implement a control, but also to go back in and keep checking as to what we are doing. Is it good enough? Is it right? Or is there a room for improvement? So we need to constantly keep asking, is there a room for improvement? Obviously, but we need to do it in an efficient way, and not with an intention to kill our other partners, right? So for example, the controls around patching and updating, that is a very contentious control, and where IT complains that they don't have enough cycles to do it. So we need to find a way to bake it within their processes, or help them improve their processes, right? The next thing is, whatever we do, all the controls, they need to have a purpose. We should not have a control just for the sake of controls, or just because a document said, because a control may be applicable for a bank, but may not be for a manufacturing plant, or vice versa, right? So that is where you need to make sure that your controls are actually aligned to your business processes and your compliance requirements as well. Yeah, same control will not apply between America and India. So the same. So you need to make sure that you have a good handle on your requirements. What am I needed to do? Okay, so don't just follow blindly that I did a particular thing in my last organization, so I will continue to do it in the new organization. You need to make sure of the relevance. Okay, the next one is user education. So you need to make sure that you're training your people on the controls that not just people, it's basically whoever is your stakeholder. That could be the CEO or that could be the lowest person in the whole of the organization. So you need to make sure that you're communicating, constantly communicating about the controls that affects them or where you need them to be somehow accountable or responsible for. Okay? And finally is about efficiency, because the number of controls, the number of threats is only increasing, but the amount of money or the budget available for the people or the systems is not increasing at that pace, right? So we need to be smart about that, and where possible, we should automate the monitoring and the management of the controls or even the operations of the controls. For example, we talked about automation being a best practice in incident management. Same goes for you could possibly automate how you implement security hardening for network devices, endpoints, or servers, right? So, because those are things that you could have as a checklist and you could automate those things that you apply. And there are a number of tools that are available in the market to do so. You just have to talk to the right IT peoples, and maybe this could be, if you are a GRC analyst, this could be an input to your cybersecurity manager who can then talk to the IT head or the CIO to automate as many things as possible so that you keep your cybersecurity function as efficient as it can be. Okay. All right. So this week was quite heavy, but let's do a quick recap of what we learned through the last couple of minutes. So we talked about all the different controls coming together for a more effective cybersecurity protection, right? So it needs to be holistic, it needs to be complete, and these cybersecurity control domains, they provide us with that mechanism, with the structure to implement and actually define the controls to protect our assets. Okay, so they give us a structure. Each of these domains help us protect a certain element of the whole ecosystem. I use the word ecosystem because we have the network, which is taking care of the transmission and connection. We have the endpoint devices, like the laptops, mobiles devices, the servers. So we have a domain about that. We have a domain about applications. So each of these are highly specialized in themselves. And if you want, you could go and specialize in each of them. Okay. And last but not the least, planning for it and doing it is one thing, but make sure you're going back and keep checking and reviewing to find the room for improvement. So review cycle is very, very important. And we also talked about how incident management can be a good feedback to back to the governance function or risk management function or compliance of how the different incidents might be impacting the rules of the game. Okay, and what needs to be changed, or if people need to be made more security aware, things like that, right? So with that, I will say thank you so much to staying with me. And next week onwards is going to get super, super, super exciting here, because we will start our hands-on activities. We will, so now starting next week, week 6, we will start with writing some policies, standards, and procedures. Okay, so next week is also going to be super heavy, but super, super exciting. And this might be what a lot of people kind of might have been following. Because, and one thing I do want to say is that starting next week, I will actually be introducing a concept of assignment, virtual assignment. So where you would get a chance to follow through the tutorial and then get some practical use cases so that you can practice what you've learned through the session, right? So these last 4 weeks and today, so the week 5th, the 5 weeks were learning and absorbing a lot of the knowledge. But week 6 onwards, which is next week, you would have actually get the use cases and see real examples of how things are done, what a policy looks like, what a standard looks like, and what a procedure looks like. What are some of the best practices that you should keep in mind? What you should avoid when writing these documents, okay? And how to communicate it to users, including your approving bodies. And we'll also look at the life cycle and some of the smart ways of how you can manage that. Okay. And towards the end of the week 6, I will introduce a bit of a surprise there, and we'll bring in a concept of the use of AI in policy standards and procedures. So I hope you remain excited for next week. And I know that today's session was quite heavy. And like I said, each of these domains are a specialization in themselves. So if you did not get enough of what you were hoping for, then please do put it in the comments and I will aim to create some additional resources to help you with some specific topics. But until then, I'll say bye-bye and thank you so much. If you have not subscribed to my channel yet, please take this moment to do that. And for now, this is me, Priyanka, saying thank you so much.